Okay, this is a quick tutorial on one very handy little feature in Adobe Premiere and After Effects. That is the warp stabilizer. As you can see, this animation that I have here, we were shooting it outside on the beach with a DSLR camera, and there's just a little jitter from when we were pressing the shutter. Now, it's subtle, but I'd like to get rid of that. Now, if you notice, I have my footage imported into Premiere, and I've already done any little bits of editing that I want to do as far as like cutting a couple frames out. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to nest these edits into one additional sequence. And so for the warp stabilizer to work, you need to have your footage be the same size as the sequence. So you can't have applied any scaling effects or other sorts of like crops or masks or anything to it. So that's why I did my edits in one sequence and then I nested it now into this other sequence here. So I can select this sequence now, and if I go to search the effects, then I can search for warp stabilizer. There it is. And then I just drag this onto the clip. Now we'll go back to the effect controls. So you'll notice that there's this little blue bar that says it's analyzing in the background. And what that means is that the computer is looking at every single frame and it's looking for those little micro aberrations, and it's going to try to line those up. So you can see here over on this side how it's doing, and this takes a little while, especially if you have a long clip. So I'll go through some of the other features that this has while we're waiting for the analyzation. You have some options here. One is what kind of stabilization you want. You could either go for smooth motion. So if you have like a camera pan or something and it's got a little bit of handheld shake to it that you want to try and smooth out, you can choose smooth motion. In this instance, we want the images to look like they're rock solid, and so I'm going to choose no motion. And so the method that it uses to correct, there's a variety of different methods, and that sort of depends on how you want the final footage to work. So on one hand, you can have it just transform position and try to match it. This works well if you have just a little bit of like X and Y shake on it. If there's a lot of rotation that happens, which is maybe more what might happen if you're like pressing the shutter on a camera in animation, then definitely having scale and rotation might be most useful. Perspective will also kind of like warp a little bit along the z-axis, like if your camera like accidentally turned, then the perspective might be good. And subspace warp, it sort of does this little bit of like stretching and other sorts of things. You can play around and just see what works best, honestly, and what looks right to you. There's other little features that you can play around with here. The one thing to note is that when the computer is stabilizing your image, it is going to crop it in a little bit. So you're going to lose a little information, and how much you lose depends on how big those aberrations are. If you really knocked the camera out of position, then it's going to crop it way in because it's trying to fill the frame with things that line up in every single frame. If you just have a little subtle shake, like the example here, you know, these tiny little movements, like these little up and down movements as we are going along, that's not going to cause a whole lot of cropping. And so if you look back here, if I switch to this composition, you can see it's just tiny bit zoomed in. And then the advanced tab, if you don't feel like the first pass at this was very effective or you didn't get the results you want, you can try a detailed analysis. And what that will do is it will take a lot longer, but there's a lot of other features, and honestly I don't know what all of these things do, so you can go and like read about it on the Adobe forums and help menus if you want to get really into this. But I've found that just dropping this effect onto footage that has just a little bit of camera shake actually does a really good job. So now you can see this animation has no movement. It is rock solid. Let's try one more piece of footage that maybe has a little bit more shake to it here. So when I play this back, you can see that this is just a little 1-second test, and you can see there's quite a bit of movement happening. Now, I'm very curious to know how this will work because we have some movement in this white piece of paper because the paper was not taped down. But then we also have a different movement that's coming from the camera shake that's affecting the background. And so we'll see what the computer decides to focus on. So I'm just going to drop this right on the clip this time. No editing here. And we're going to wait for it to analyze. Not very long clip, so here we go. So I'm just using the defaults now. Let's see what we got. All right. So as you can see, the shake and the jitter that's happened in the background of this clip has disappeared, and it has ignored these bigger movements of the paper, which of course if you didn't want that paper moving, you would want to tape it down, right? But overall, it didn't crop it too much, so that's good. You didn't lose any essential information from the clip, and it looks like your tripod and your camera are really locked down. So that's a great little trick that you can use on your footage if you need it. It's always better to lock your tripod and use a remote shutter for your camera to avoid any sort of jitter or camera shake. But of course, that's not always an option when you're working out in the field or working at home.